Montana Territory, June 1882. The rain came down in cold, slanting sheets as Calla Ellery stumbled deeper into the thicket, her once fine wedding dress torn at the hem and soaked through with mud. Every step she took away from the church in Willow Creek felt like ripping another chain from her body. She did not look back. She could not. Behind her was the life they had chosen for her, a man twice her age, a marriage built on land and cattle, not love. Branches scratched her arms, snagging the lace on her sleeves. Her lungs burned from running, but fear kept her legs moving. She had no plan beyond escape. The woods were endless, dark, and wild. Still, it was better than life as a bargaining chip in someone else's deal. Miles behind her, in the dry warmth of the saloon, Everett Easton leaned against the bar, rolling the rim of his glass between his fingers. His jaw tightened as the town's mayor shoved a thick envelope into his vest pocket. "Bring her back, Easton," the mayor said, voice low, eyes sharp. "Unharmed. Fast." Everett had been a tracker most of his life, paid to find lost cattle, runaway criminals, even the occasional debtor. But a runaway bride? That was new. Still, money was money, and he needed it more than he cared to admit. He saddled his horse, a patient gray gelding named Slate, and rode out into the gathering storm, following the faint trail of torn lace and broken branches. Calla pressed on through the woods, heart pounding. The rain turned the earth into slick clay, and her boots slipped more than once. Night was falling fast, shadows stretching long between the trees. She stumbled into a clearing and collapsed near a fallen log, hugging her knees against the cold. Tears welled up, but she blinked them away. Crying would not help. She needed to think. She needed a twig snapped. She jerked her head up, heart hammering. A dark figure on horseback emerged from the trees, cutting a sharp silhouette against the gray sky. Panic flooded her veins. She scrambled to her feet and ran, but the mud sucked at her boots, slowing her down. Within seconds, the man dismounted and closed the distance between them. "Easy," he said, voice low but firm. Calla spun around, fists clenched, ready to fight if she had to. She backed up until her calves hit the fallen log. "I am not going back," she said, shaking with cold and rage. Everett took a slow step closer, hands raised. "Name is Everett Easton. I was hired to find you, not to hurt you. You will have to drag me back in chains," she snapped. For a moment, he just looked at her, really looked. Mud-streaked face, defiant blue eyes, trembling hands. She was terrified, but still standing, still fighting. Something shifted inside him. "You are freezing," he said, shrugging off his oilskin coat and holding it out to her. She glared at him, unmoving. "You will catch fever if you stay wet much longer," he added. The coat hung between them like a peace offering. Slowly, reluctantly, Calla took it, wrapping it around her shoulders. The heavy fabric smelled of leather, smoke, and something else, something steady. Everett crouched down and started gathering dry twigs under the shelter of a dense pine. His movements were calm, methodical. "What are you doing?" she asked, voice hoarse. "Building a fire," he said without looking up. "We will talk when you are warm." Calla hesitated, then sank down near him. Her teeth chattered as she watched him work. Sparks caught, a small flame growing into a steady fire. She stretched her frozen hands toward the heat. Neither spoke for a long while. The woods whispered around them, rain tapping on the leaves overhead. Finally, Everett broke the silence. "Why run?" She stared into the fire. "My father sold me off like a heifer," she said, voice flat. "Married to a man I do not love. A man who does not love me, only wants my family's land." Everett nodded once, slow and understanding. "I will not go back," she said again, fiercer this time. He rubbed a hand over his jaw, studying her. She was young but not naive. She knew exactly what she was risking. "You have a plan?" he asked. Calla shook her head, a bitter laugh escaping. "Run until I cannot run anymore." Everett leaned back against a tree, crossing his arms. "You will not last a week out here alone. I would rather die free than live in a cage," she said fiercely. The fire crackled between them. Everett watched the flames for a long moment. "I could say I lost your trail," he said finally. His voice was careful, low. Calla blinked at him, not sure she had heard right. You would lie for me? Everett shrugged, eyes steady on hers. Maybe I do not like the idea of dragging a woman back to a life she does not want. Maybe I think you deserve better. Calla stared at him, heart thudding hard for a different reason now. Why would you do that for me? She whispered. He looked at her, then really looked like he was seeing not just the mud-streaked girl in front of him, but everything she had been through. Everything she was still fighting for. Because, he said simply, you remind me what it means to fight for your own life. The words sank into her, warm and solid. For the first time since she had run, Calla felt something other than fear. Hope flickered inside her, small but stubborn. Everett kicked more wood onto the fire, then pulled his bedroll from Slate's saddle. You get some rest, he said. We will figure out what comes next in the morning. Calla hesitated, but exhaustion dragged at her bones. She curled up near the fire, wrapped in Everett's coat, watching him as he settled against the tree. The last thing she saw before sleep claimed her was Everett Easton, sitting silent and steady, keeping watch over her like he had already decided she was worth protecting. And somewhere deep inside, Calla knew her life had changed tonight. Forever. Dawn crept through the trees in a soft gray hush. The fire burned down to a bed of glowing coals. Calla stirred beneath Everett's coat, her muscles stiff from the chill and the hard ground. She sat up slowly, watching as Everett saddled Slate with quiet efficiency. He glanced over at her, one brow lifting. Figured you might be hungry, he said, pulling a small cloth bundle from his saddlebag. He tossed it to her, and she caught it with clumsy fingers, the lingering cold numbing her hands. Inside were 2 thick slices of bread and a twist of dried venison. Calla tore into the bread first, her stomach hollow with hunger. She ate quickly, grateful beyond words, while Everett tightened the girth strap and checked the bridle. When she finished, she wiped her mouth with the back of her hand and looked up at him. What happens now? She asked. Everett adjusted the rifle tied to Slate's saddle before answering. You have 2 choices, he said. You can ride with me a while, get yourself somewhere safe. Or you can strike out alone, but I won't be there to pull you out of trouble next time. Calla brushed a strand of tangled hair from her face, considering. Her pride warred with her sense. Alone, she would likely die out here. With him, she had a chance. I will ride with you, she said, lifting her chin. He gave a short nod. Good. We aim west. Less eyes that way. Everett mounted up and offered her hand. She hesitated only a moment before grasping it. His palm was rough, warm, steady. He pulled her up behind him as if she weighed nothing. Calla settled against his back, awkward at first, but necessity pressed her close. The horse shifted beneath them, and Everett clicked his tongue, steering them toward the thinning trees. The trail west was narrow and rugged, the land rolling out in low, pine-dotted hills. They rode in silence for a long time, the only sounds the creak of leather and the rhythmic clop of Slate's hooves. Eventually, Calla found her voice. Where are you from? She asked, her breath stirring the fabric of his shirt. Texas, he answered after a pause. South of San Antonio. Left after the war. She said nothing, sensing more behind the words. Instead, she asked, why come all the way to Montana? Work, he said simply. Land down there's picked clean. Up here, a man can still breathe. Calla rested her cheek lightly against his back, the steady movement of his body soothing in a way she hadn't expected. What about you? Everett asked, turning his head slightly. I was born in Helena, she said. My father brought us west chasing gold, but he never struck it rich. Settled on ranching instead. Everett grunted low in his throat as if that explained a great deal. They crested a rise, and the valley unfolded before them, wide and green under the lifting mist. A narrow river cut through the center, its waters flashing silver in the morning light. Everett guided Slate toward the riverbank where cottonwoods leaned over the water. They dismounted and Calla stretched her legs, wincing at the stiffness. Everett led Slate to drink, then knelt by the bank to splash water on his face. Calla followed, cupping her hands to bring the cold water to her lips. It tasted clean and sharp. When she sat back on her heels, Everett was watching her, his expression unreadable. You ever handled a horse on your own? He asked. A little, she said. My brother taught me some before he left for Oregon. He nodded and pulled a length of rope from his saddlebag. "Time to learn better," he said, handing it to her. "If you are going to stay ahead of trouble, you need to know how to ride proper." Calla looked at the rope, then at Slate, who snorted and shook his mane. "I will try," she said. Everett softened just a fraction. "Trying's the only way anything gets done out here." They spent the next hour working. Everett showed her how to loop the rope into reins, how to lead Slate in a circle, how to mount and dismount without losing balance. His instructions were short, patient, and he corrected her hands only when necessary, his touch brief and respectful. By the time the sun climbed higher, Calla could guide Slate in a slow walk along the river without Everett's hand on the lead. She grinned, wind whipping her hair, a laugh catching in her throat. "You are a quick study," Everett said, a rare spark of approval in his voice. "You are a good teacher," she replied, pride warming her chest. He looked at her then, long and steady, something different in his gaze. Not pity, not obligation, something truer, quieter. The air between them shifted, as real as the river breeze. Everett turned away first, adjusting Slate's saddle again. "We need to keep moving," he said, voice rougher than before. Calla swung herself down from the horse, landing lightly. "Where to?" she asked. He glanced west, where the mountains rose in a blue, jagged line against the sky. "Somewhere no one knows your name," he said. Calla followed his gaze, heart steady for the first time in days. "Good," she said. "That is exactly where I want to be." They rode out side by side, the morning sun breaking through the clouds, the land stretching wide and full of promise before them. By midday, the land shifted beneath them, flattening into broad, open meadows stitched with sage and wild mustard. The sun beat down hard, drying the mud on Calla's borrowed dress into stiff patches. Everett slowed Slate to a walk, scanning the horizon where a few haggard cottonwoods clawed at the sky. "We need shelter before night," Everett said, his voice carrying a faint rasp from the dust. Calla adjusted her grip on the saddle horn. "Will we find any?" "Old Trapper's cabin, maybe a mile west of here," he said. "No one's used it in years, but it's better than the open ground." They rode on, the wind tugging at Calla's hair, and she thought about the people who had lived out here before them, trappers, hunters, those who tried to carve a life from the raw land. Brave or foolish, maybe both. When the cabin finally came into view, it looked as weary as the land around it. The roof sagged in the middle, and the door hung crooked on one hinge. A few blackened stones marked where a chimney once stood. Everett tied Slate to a leaning fence post and pushed the door open with his boot. It creaked wide, revealing a single room with a dirt floor and a collapsed bunk in one corner. Dust motes spun in the thin shafts of light cutting through the broken roof. "It will do," Everett said, stepping inside. Calla hesitated on the threshold. "Are you sure it is safe?" He gave a short nod. "Safer than sleeping out where anything with teeth might wander by." Inside, Everett shifted a few boards into a rough barrier against the wind. Calla gathered brittle twigs from around the cabin to stack near the hearth. Neither spoke much, but the silence between them had softened, no longer edged with fear. When the sun dipped low and the sky bruised to purple, Everett handed her a rusted tin cup filled with water from a nearby spring. She drank deeply, grateful. "You ever think about what you want?" Everett asked, settling across from her on the floor. Calla wrapped her arms around her knees, considering. "I used to," she said finally, "before everything became about duty. I wanted to teach, maybe, open a little schoolhouse somewhere." Everett rubbed his thumb along the rim of his cup. "You would have been good at that." "You say that like you know me," she said, a touch of wonder in her voice. "I know enough," he said. "You got grit and heart. That counts for more than folks figure." Calla looked at him across the dim room, feeling the words settle into her like seeds finding good soil. "What about you?" she asked. "What did you want?" Everett leaned his head back against the wall, the worn lines of his face deepening in the fading light. Land of my own, he said. A place to put down roots. Build something that lasts longer than a season. Calla smiled faintly. Seems we both want things that won't come easy. Nothing worth having ever does, he said. The fire they built in the hearth was small but steady, casting a gentle glow over the battered walls. Calla sat close to it, warming her hands, while Everett cleaned his rifle with slow, deliberate motions. After a long stretch of quiet, Calla spoke again. You do not talk much, do you? Everett glanced at her, his mouth tipping into a brief, wry line. Words ain't much good if they ain't true. She tucked that away, liking it more than she could say. Later, when sleep pressed heavy on her, she unrolled the bedroll Everett had pulled from Slate's saddle and made a place near the fire. Everett took up a post near the doorway, his rifle within reach. You do not have to stay awake all night, she said, her voice soft with exhaustion. I do, he answered. You are under my protection now. Calla blinked at him through the firelight, the meaning behind his words sinking deep. Thank you, she whispered. Everett tipped his hat lower over his brow, but not before she caught the flicker of something in his eyes, something steady and sure. She laid her head down and let sleep take her, knowing for the first time in too long that she was safe. And that somehow and possibly she was no longer alone. Morning light poured through the broken slats of the cabin roof, laying long stripes across the dirt floor. Calla sat up slowly, her body sore but rested. Everett was already outside, tending to Slate. She rose, brushing dust from her skirts, and stepped into the fresh air. Everett glanced over his shoulder as she approached, his hand steady on the horse's neck. Day's clear, he said. Good time to move. Calla nodded, shielding her eyes against the low sun. Where will we go? There's a ranch about a day's ride west, Everett replied, looping the reins through his fingers. Old friend runs it. He might take us in for a spell. Will he ask questions? She asked, brushing a lock of hair back from her face. Everett adjusted the cinch strap before answering. He knows better than to poke where he's not welcome. They set out across the open country, the rhythm of Slate's stride soothing beneath them. As the hours stretched on, the land shifted again, growing rockier, the grass giving way to dry, broken earth. A hawk circled overhead, its shadow gliding over the ground. Near midday, Everett drew Slate to a halt beside a narrow creek, the banks crowded with pale green willows. He swung down and offered his hand to Calla. She slid from the saddle, her legs trembling slightly from the long ride. You are holding up better than most would, Everett said, leading Slate to drink. Calla knelt by the water, cupping a handful to her lips. The coolness was sharp and bright against the heat of the day. I didn't have much choice growing up, she said, watching the creek rush past. If I wanted to keep up with my brothers, I had to learn to be tough. Everett crouched beside her, his hat shading his eyes. You had brothers? He asked. 2, she said, trailing her fingers through the water. Benjamin and Eli, both older, both gone west years ago. I stayed behind. Until now. Everett listened without interruption, his presence quiet but solid. Sometimes, she continued, her voice low, I wonder if they ever think of me. They do, Everett said, sure and steady. Blood like that doesn't forget. Calla smiled faintly, the ache in her chest easing a little. They shared a strip of jerky and a piece of hard bread Everett had packed, sitting side by side on a flat stone. The meal was spare, but hunger made it taste better than any fine supper Calla could remember. Afterward, they rode on, the land rising into low, scrub-brushed hills. As they climbed, Calla spotted a weathered post jutting from a ridge, a tangle of old wire clinging to it. Fence line, Everett said, following her gaze. Means we're close. Sure enough, as they crested the hill, a spread of land unfolded below them, a wide valley dotted with cattle, a whitewashed ranch house tucked against a stand of cottonwoods, smoke curling from its chimney. Everett guided Slate down the slope, his posture easing as they neared the house. Calla felt a strange flutter in her chest, not fear, exactly, but the wary hope of stepping into someplace unknown. A man stepped out onto the porch as they approached, wiping his hands on a rag. His hair was streaked with gray, his eyes sharp beneath the brim of his battered hat. "Thought you were dead, Easton," the man called. "Not yet," Everett said, dismounting. The two men clasped hands, a brief, firm greeting. Calla stayed back, unsure, until Everett beckoned her forward. "This is Calla," Everett said. "She's under my care." The rancher nodded once, sizing her up with a glance that wasn't unkind. "Name's Roy Mercer," he said. "You're welcome here. Long as you pull your weight." "I will," Calla said, her voice clear. Mercer jerked his thumb toward the barn. "You can stable your horse and wash up. Supper's at sundown." Everett led Slade away and Calla followed. Inside the barn, the air was thick with the scent of hay and horses. They worked in companionable silence, stripping the saddle and brushing Slade down. When they finished, Everett leaned against a stall door, watching her tie up the bridle with careful fingers. "You picked that up fast," he said. "Necessity," she replied, flashing him a tired smile. He studied her for a moment, something thoughtful in his gaze. "You are not the same woman I found in the woods," he said. Calla met his eyes steadily. "Maybe I am just finally becoming who I was meant to be." Everett's mouth curved, not into amusement, but something quieter. Approval. Respect. They headed toward the house as the sun dipped lower, the fields bathed in gold. The porch creaked under their boots as they climbed the steps. Calla paused at the door, looking back at the wide land stretching out behind them. "Do you think," she said, voice hesitant, "a person can really start new out here?" Everett touched the brim of his hat, his eyes never leaving hers. "I think the only place a soul can truly start over is where no one knows your past," he said, "and where someone believes you're worth the trouble." Calla felt something shift deep inside her, as sure as the changing seasons. For the first time since she'd fled that church, she believed it too. The days that followed settled into a steady rhythm. Calla rose early with the rest of the ranch hands. Her hands blistered and sore from learning to mend fences and drive cattle. But she didn't complain. Everett worked nearby, his presence a quiet reassurance. One evening, after the dusk had deepened into a velvet blue, Everett found her sitting on the back steps, brushing dust from her skirts and watching the stars wink out one by one. He eased down beside her, though groaning under his weight. "You are healing into this life," Everett said, his voice low. "I thought I would feel like a guest here," Calla replied, tucking a loose strand of hair behind her ear. "But it feels more like breathing." Everett rested his forearms on his knees, gaze fixed on the dark horizon. "That's how you know it's yours," he said. Calla studied the strong line of his jaw, the way the evening light caught the silver at his temples. She had come to know the way he spoke only when he had something worth saying, and the way he watched over her without making it a cage. "You said you wanted land of your own," she said after a while. "Have you thought about where?" Everett tipped his hat back slightly, the stars reflecting in his eyes. "There's a valley west of here," he said. "Good soil, enough water, not crowded yet. I was saving up to stake a claim before everything." Calla drew a slow breath, feeling the ground shift beneath her in some unseen way. "You could still do it," she said. "We could." Everett turned to her then, fully, the weight of his gaze steady and searching. "You mean that?" "I do," Calla said, the words sure in her mouth. "I am tired of running. I want to make something that is mine. Ours." He reached for her hand, rough fingers brushing hers, and she let him take it. His thumb traced the edge of her knuckles with a gentleness that unraveled something tightly woven inside her. "I reckon I have been waiting a long time to find someone who wanted the same," he said. Calla smiled, small and true. "Then let us stop waiting," she whispered. They rose together, moving inside where Mercer had cleared a corner of the bunkhouse for them. It was nothing more than a rough-hewn cot and a battered chest, but it was private, and it was theirs. Everett struck a match and lit the oil lamp, the glow softening the hard lines of the room. He stood there a moment, hat in his hands, as if searching for the right words. "I have not got fine promises to offer," he said. "Only a life built honest. One where you'd never have to run again." Calla stepped closer, her heart steady as a river in spring. "That is all I ever wanted," she said. He kissed her then, slow and sure, his hands cradling her face like she was something precious. She wound her arms around his neck, holding him close, feeling the warmth and strength of him sink into her bones. When they pulled apart, Everett rested his forehead against hers. "We'll ride out in the morning," he said. "Find that valley. Build something real." Calla nodded, tears thick in her throat, but they were good tears, the kind that came when the world cracked open in the right way. The next morning dawned bright and clear. Mercer clapped Everett on the back and pressed a small sack of supplies into his hands before they rode out. Calla turned once in the saddle, looking back at the ranch, grateful for the place that had given them their start. They traveled west for 2 days, through rolling hills and shallow streams, until they reached a valley nestled between 2 low ridges. The grass grew thick and green, and a creek wound silver through it. Everett drew Slate to a halt and swung down, surveying the land with an assessing eye. Calla dismounted and stood beside him, her heart thrumming with quiet wonder. "This is it," Everett said. "It is beautiful," she breathed. He turned to her, a rare smile lighting his face. "It will be more with you here." They set up a small camp at the edge of the creek. Everett built a fire while Calla unpacked the supplies. That night they slept under the open sky, the stars spinning slow above them, and when Everett pulled her into the crook of his arm, she fit there like she had always belonged. In the weeks that followed, they worked from dawn until the last light faded. Everett built a rough cabin with his own hands, teaching Calla how to square beams and drive nails. She planted a small garden near the creek, her fingers aching but sure in the soil. They dug a well, fenced a pasture, and set up a pen for the 2 young cows Mercer had sent with them as a wedding gift when word reached him they had married. Their wedding had been simple, a preacher traveling through the valley, a few solemn words, a ring Everett had hammered from a scrap of silver. But it had been enough. More than enough. As summer ripened into fall, the cabin stood firm against the wind, smoke curling from its chimney, a light in the wildness. Calla sat on the front step one evening, mending a shirt, while Everett sharpened tools nearby. She looked up from her sewing, catching the way the sunset painted his face gold. "You look like you belong to this land," she said. He set the sharpening stone down and crossed to her, resting a hand on the back of her chair. "I belong wherever you are," he said simply. Calla rose, setting her sewing aside. She cupped his face in her hands, the stubble rough against her palms, and kissed him with all the quiet, fierce love that had grown between them. The wind stirred the prairie grass around them, and the cabin stood strong behind them, a testament to what they had built together. In the years that followed, the valley blossomed under their care. They raised cattle, planted apple trees, and built an extra room onto the cabin when the time came. Everett carved Calla a rocking chair for the front porch, where she sat on warm evenings, her hands resting on the swell of her belly as the sun dipped low. Neighbors eventually settled nearby, and the valley grew into a small, close community. But Calla and Everett never forgot those first days, when it was only them against the wide, wild world. They held on to each other through every storm, every hard winter, every joy and sorrow, knowing that love like theirs was rare and worth every scar it took to find. And so they lived, not just happily, but deeply, rooted in the land and each other, their hearts stitched together as surely as the beams of their home.